Good evening. Welcome to Liberty Classical Academy's Education in Society series. This is, I believe, the fifth speaker that we have invited in over the course of the last couple of years to join us in our Education in Society. We believe as a school that it's extremely important to model respectful dialogue and respectful debate. And we also believe it's very important to instill an understanding of the importance of education and what shapes education and shapes excellent education. And so therefore, we think that this is such an important event that we actually ask our upper school students to be here, might I say require, because we believe this is so important for them to hear. And we invite community members at large to join us as well, and then we also have our Liberty community, which we always enjoy having with us, because this is what makes Liberty. Liberty is the people that are out in this audience today. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Mitch Pearlstein, who is joining us as our speaker tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce him, but then once he's finished speaking, we'll allow about 30 minutes for a question and answer time, and two of us will be walking around with microphones, and you'll be able to ask questions as you see fit. So Dr. Mitch Pearlstein is the founder and senior fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. His work in education and policy spans several decades and focuses consistently on building education policy rooted in cultural and social context. He's worked with the American Experiment since he launched the think tank in 1990. He also worked with the U.S. Department of Education, was the special assistant for policy and communications to Governor Al Quie, and he also served as a research fellow at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Also, as an assistant to the University of Minnesota President, C. Peter McGrath. Dr. Pearlstein has been a columnist, author, policy expert, and thought leader since his launch into educational leadership in the 1970s. He's written several books, one entitled Riding into the Sunrise, Al Quie, A Life of Faith, Service, and Civility. A second one is entitled From Family Collapse to America's Decline. A third, Broken Bonds, and then he has a new book coming out this April called Education, Roads Less Traveled. Please join me in welcoming Mitch Pearlstein.
Am I supposed to move this way? This is wonderful. This is a wonderful I better be good, God. And Rebecca, that was a wonderful introduction. But you could have added, by the way, this joke has worked for 20 some odd years. You could have added that I'm Jewish and the founder of a conservative think tank. That's not the punchline. My wife is ordained Episcopal clergy who used to run a homeless shelter for a Lutheran church. Pause. And we sent all the kids to Catholic schools. Thank you for laughing. That is very good. Great pleasure to be here for my second visit. I was here about a year ago, and very pleased that my great friend, Senator Chamberlain, is here. I'll be talking about educational freedom and school choice as we go along, one of the great champions in the Minnesota legislature for education freedom and choice. And I see someone getting ready to applaud, so I applaud. Well, let me start this way. About 40 years ago, a mere 40 years ago, right at this moment, I was, actually, let me take is there a clock I can look? We can go to about 11, right? Is that what we're doing? Okay. I have no idea how long these remarks are, and if they start just dragging on, we'll go right to the questions and answers. 40 years ago, I was in graduate school at the university, and I was in the midst of writing a dissertation on Jewish attitudes towards affirmative action admissions in higher education. And it's a good thing that all questions about affirmative action admissions in higher education have been settled for a long time. That was a joke. And one of the things I read, one of the things that the dissertation gave me an opportunity and a spur to do was to read a lot of Jewish history and sociology that I had not. And what I was looking for in part was, all right, what about Jewish political history, cultural, intellectual history, that would suggest that why Jews, if you go through the 50s and 1960s, were active, very active members of the Civil Rights Coalition, had turned, many of them, not all by any stretch, in the 1960s and 1970s, to be critics of affirmative action. What was it about our history that suggested that? And one of the more insightful things I remember reading was, in a history that is that long, thousands and thousands of years, you can find anything you would like to find. And there's a connection to what we'll be talking about tonight about American education. Successes, failures, you can find anything you want to find. And while I'm a critic in some respects, I am very much of a fan at the same time. And I am exceedingly thankful for what education in this country has done for me. Likewise, I don't want to sound this evening like a cranky old guy. I'm still far too young and vibrant to be a curmudgeon. And there was a time about 20 some odd years ago, stop me if I keep on talking about too many years ago, I had this opportunity to speak to a group, let me put my glasses down, speak to a group in Singapore. I think it could have been the Singapore National University. Someone got me a gig in Singapore. And I wound up talking about family problems, family fragmentation, family breakdown. Family fragmentation, by the way, is the new term of art. And I got to tell you, I'm going through the numbers and I started feeling unpatriotic. Here I was halfway around the world and I was saying these critical things about my country. So I'm alert to those kinds of dynamics. So with that as prologue, a couple of numbers. There are two major international evaluations of what American kids know or what they don't know and how they stack up to the rest of the world, and they come out every couple of years. And one of them is called PISA, P-I-S-A, and I wish I could remember what it stood for. In 2015, there was another round. These results come out about every 3 years, and they look at kids in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade, generally, though not always, in math and science and reading. And how did American kids do? Middling is the answer, no better than middling. Slightly above the international average in reading and in science, but below the international average in math. More specifically, 3 years prior, in 2012, the United States ranked 24th in reading, 28th in science, and 36th in math. Now, some people might say, well, that has to do with the fact we have a lot of poor kids and we have a lot of minority kids in the United States and many other nations don't. Well, that's not the problem. One of the areas that is examined is how well do our strongest students do compared to the strongest students elsewhere around the world. And when it comes to mathematics literacy, proficiency, if you get a 5 or above, that means that's real good. The average for something called OECD nations, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a major international organization that the United States is part of, headquartered in Paris. For all these nations, 12.6% of kids were 5 and above, 12.6. In the United States, only 8.8 80% of our students were doing that well. So it's not just a matter of our poor kids bringing down the numbers. Frankly, it's also many of our most talented kids doing the same. All right, so if we did 8.8%, how was it in Singapore? 40% of their kids were 5 or above, and in Shanghai, 55%. But we also did less well. People know how well in math, especially kids in Asia, frequently do. But we also did less well compared to some nations you wouldn't think we did less well in opposition to or in comparison with. For example, in math, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, Vietnam, and the Slovak Republic. I think we were tied in one of these comparisons with Slovenia, and I was in poor taste one day and made a comment about Slovenia, but our senior senator's family is from Slovenia, and Amy's a good friend. In terms of high school graduation rates, the United States is below the OECD average. If we didn't formally lead the world, we were awfully close. The rest of the world is catching up, even as our numbers are beginning to go up a bit. When it came to college participation rates and college graduation rates, we had been shrinking compared to the rest of the world. The rest of the world has not only caught up in these areas, but frequently they surpass us. But does it matter? The good question is, does it matter? We're doing pretty well. We still lead the world economically and in some other things. I have some very nice friends. One of the great benefits of being a think tank guy for a long time is that I get to hang out with some really good people, international celebrities of a public policy, political sort, but in this instance, some terrific academics. And there's an economist at Stanford by the name of Rick Hanishak, and he's done a lot of work about what does it mean for a nation, what does it mean for individuals, but also for a nation, when performance on standardized tests is not all that good. And he wrote a number of years ago, there is now considerable evidence that cognitive skills measured by test scores are directly related to individual earnings, as you might expect, but also to productivity and economic growth, and it's particularly salient when it comes to productivity and economic growth. So for a nation like the United States, we are hurt in terms of our economic power, our economic strength, because we're simply not doing as well academically as one would hope. But before going on, let me, in fairness, and keep my conscience clear, talk about a couple things that work well by my lights when it comes to American education. We still do, as I just suggested, lead the world economically, so we must be doing something right academically. We are frequently cited for having great flexibility and freedom in how we pursue education in this country, and that has something to do with all the Nobel Prizes we win more than anybody else. And I'll return to Nobel Prizes in a different way in a few moments. We have a mix of both public and private institutions. Pluralism is good, but we need more private schools. And I say that not just because I'm here at this remarkable place. We need more private schools, and we need more opportunities for lower income and middle income kids to attend private and religiously animated schools. We'll return to that. The United States is often described as a nation of opportunity, as we are, land of opportunity. What works better for me is to think of the United States as a place of second and third chances. And many of us need second and third chances. I assure you I did. There's intrinsic good in that. At the same time, when it comes to education, if kids think, if they know, they can mess around a bit, and I'll get back to my story in a few moments, and know you could always come back, and you'll have a second chance and a third chance to do something, well, that might mean you're not working as hard the first time around as you should. So it's two-edged, but on balance, it's wonderful we have second and third chances here. For all the talk these days, how we do not get along with each other, my argument, and we can talk about it later, is that we get along with each other far better, generally speaking, than we give ourselves credit for. One of the reasons is American education. And when it comes to private schools in these situations, some critics will say, critics of private schools, critics of school choice will say, well, those private schools are not tolerant. Yes, they are. I bet you can tell me that they are. There's been research to show that young people in private schools, religious schools, are every bit as tolerant as kids in public schools, and there's some research to show that they're even more so. When it comes to colleges and universities, I am driven nuts by political correctness. I started writing about this in, again, graduate school in the late 1970s. I wrote a paper called Academic Values and Political Orthodoxy, and political orthodoxy was political correctness before the term was really used, and I got one of the greatest compliments from a professor for the paper. She gave me an A or an A+, and this was meant as a compliment, by the way. She said, this is a significant contribution to the sociology of ignorance, which I took as a great compliment and still do. And I would end this segment by saying, take a look at the folks in the room. Think about yourself, think about your families, think about your friends. You're all doing, for the most part, really quite nicely. And American education has had something, often a lot, to do with that. But why do we do so middling? I'm going to talk about some policy and structural reasons, to use the jargon, first, then I'm going to get to the stuff that really animates me, the more cultural, social kinds of things. I wrote a chapter in a book, oh, now I need my glasses, about 4 years ago, about Minnesota education. And I asked a colleague on the board of directors of the center what he thought. What did he think the main problems with American education are? And let's just say my colleague is an opinionated fellow, and off the top of his head he gave me 13. Let me read you the 13 with a little annotation after each by me. American and Minnesota school years are too short, with kids losing too much knowledge over summer months, especially in math and the hard sciences. None of these kids are bringing in a harvest anymore. Other countries have longer school years and often longer days. I wrote, it's not just forgetting things over the summer, but not having enough time to learn enough things in the 3 seasons prior to the summer. He wrote, too many teachers are of low quality. Education majors who routinely enter college with lower SAT scores and other test scores than students majoring in other subjects then wind up getting the least rigorous academic training, he said specifically, in schools of education. I have never, and this is the closest perhaps I've gotten, I've never written bad things about teachers. They have talents and devotions that I simply do not have. But there is no question that kids, young people, older people, who go in to teaching, who go through schools of education, and I'm a product of a college of education, often do not have the same verbal skills and other skills that people in other parts of a university have. And That affects how kids learn. There's no question about that. Having said that, again, most teachers are magnificent. I have my arguments with the teacher unions, but that's another matter. Speaking of schools of education, we have, he wrote, more people with master's degrees and PhDs in education, guilty, than any society in history, and our results are worse. Again, for the record, I have one of those. Too few men and women teaching math and science have degrees in math and science. It's easier to teach a math major to teach than teach a teaching major to teach math, if you got that one. Another colleague added, would be good if teachers teaching English actually had majored in English all the time, and same thing with history and other subjects. It would be nice. Teacher union contracts and the tenure system protect weak and terrible teachers. Yes, they frequently do, though I just fundamentally, I'm uncomfortable talking about teachers that way. Teacher contracts don't allow paying market wages to master teachers of hard subjects, as teacher unions prevent such differences in compensation because it isn't fair. And my friend was accurate again. Talks about non-teaching overhead is way too high while true management is lacking. Agreed. Public school curricula have been dumbed down and made politically correct. Agreed, and all one has to do, it seems to me, take a look at textbooks in any field virtually over the last several decades, and the PC is rampant. I'll get to a point later when I may say something about how multiculturalism is the overriding consideration, it seems to me, in putting out textbooks. The myth of every kid being college ready is insane, he said. Goals ought to be realistic. Job readiness for some, tech schools and apprenticeships for others, and college for those capable of it. This is a tough subject. Just finished writing a book about it. One doesn't want to suggest to anybody you really shouldn't go to college when that is their dream. And I will never, ever try to dissuade anybody from going to a four-year school if that is their plan and that is their dream. But there is no question many young people would do better if they pursued community college degrees in technical subjects, 1 year and 2 year certificate programs, apprenticeships, training in the military, where they will have good, solid middle-class lives. And we have a situation now where a lot of young people, and I know this is a college prep school, so this really doesn't apply in the same way here, but there are so many young people in this country who, in high school, really not all that excited about getting a four-year degree, but they're pressed to do so by their peers, by their parents, by their teachers, by their school counselors, by the very air we breathe. So they go off and start out a four-year school. It doesn't work out. They're unhappy. They're not doing well. They drop out, and now they're unemployed or underemployed and quite possibly in debt, college debt. And as I say, not feeling great about themselves, when in fact there are these other options, and we need to focus on them and say, these are good options for you if that is what you so choose. Friend says a couple things about sports and parental involvement and lack of physical safety, and you can guess what he has said. I would add that when talking about improving, reforming, and always keep in mind when you hear the term school reform, reform means improvement, improvement. It doesn't mean just changing stuff. And the number of reforms that actually don't lead to improvement is a large number. We routinely focus on the wrong things. It's nice to have small classes, and you can't have immense classes, But the research is not terribly persuasive that if you reduce the class size by a couple of kids, kids are going to do much better, if better at all. We focus far too much in our debates on class size. The same thing with money. It's good to have money. I'd rather, if I were a superintendent, I'd rather have more rather than less. But there really isn't any great connection between how much is spent on a kid's education and how well he or she does academically. Sometimes, as you might imagine, the problem is the federal government. I'm not going to offer any glib across-the-board indictment of the feds. I used to work at the Department of Education of the United States of America. But federal involvement does beg questions about what's better. In many instances, most instances, top-down leadership and direction, or bottom-up. As I age, I'm a bottom-up guy more all the time. And of course, this Common Core, which I'm in a different position than many on the right who hate it. This is an issue that has been poorly handled by left and right. The fact that one of my college friends, I was on the third floor, he was on the second floor of Champlain Hall, is the president of a group called Achieve in Washington, that is the main Common Core advocacy group in the country. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that I am not going to come down heavy on it. But there's no question that the Obama administration, while not saying you will pursue Common Core, with, as the name suggests, each state pursuing similar academic activities, but they said other things that would suggest that propelled various states, well more than 45, to go in the direction of a curricular approach that might not be the best. And then we have truly absurd expectations, diverting expectation, coming out of Washington, but not just there. If you go back to 1989, this is when I was in Washington, there was a big meeting of all the governors except Rudy Perpich, who was involved in a labor problem in northern Minnesota, but all other governors met in Virginia for a big summit, and they talked about education. I think what came out of it was something called Goals 2000, if I remember correctly. And one of the things they agreed on 11 years before 2000 was that by that year, the United States would lead the world in math. Well, that was absurd, given where we were and where we still are. But we throw out these goals, and it's hard, when you think about them, to have any great faith in whatever people are saying and doing. Or with No Child Left Behind, the goal there, I think it was for 2014, that all American kids would read proficiently. Well, that wasn't going to happen either, and didn't happen. It's just akin to what goes on in this state, by the way, when it comes to, by a year certain, we're going to get rid of all homelessness. Well, that's absurd. It'd be nice. Or we're going to get rid of all poverty. That would be nice, but it's not going to happen. But we've had those big grand plans in this state as well. And then, of course, family fragmentation, as I mentioned earlier. If I have worked in one area while I've been with the center, which is going on, it'll be 29 years next month, I guess, or 2 months from now, 3 months from now, it has to do with family breakdown, new term of art, family fragmentation. Questions of education, generally in school choice, would be right up there as well. Numbers. About 40% of all American children now come into this life outside of marriage. In various communities, it is far higher. The out-of-wedlock, and I'm rounding off, out-of-wedlock birth rate for Hispanics, Latinos in this country is about 50%. For African Americans, it's over 70%. In any number of communities, such as in Hennepin County, it is well over 80%. When it comes to divorce, we just about lead the industrial world in that as well, meaning there are a lot of kids growing up in very difficult situations, many of whom are doing just great under tough circumstances, and many kids growing up under ideal circumstances are not doing well at all. But on average, and the key is on average, kids growing up in these tough situations, generally without their father living under the same roof, are doing less well than other kids by every conceivable measure. In education, without question, mental health, crime, early sexual initiation. Pick an area, and kids on average who are growing up in these tough circumstances are not doing well, comparatively speaking. Now, most people don't want to talk about these kinds of things, and I understand why. You get to be called sexist, you get to be called racist. Fact of the matter is, I was telling Senator Chamberlain a moment ago, I've been doing this so long, I think I do it reasonably well, a combination of courage and grace, that I don't needlessly offend. Some people are not happy when I talk about this, but for every person who might call me a bad name, other people are saying, thank you for doing this. Whether or not it changes anything is always a good question. I also have some legitimacy talking about this since I'm in my second marriage, and my wife is in her second marriage. We've been married now 27 plus years. I used to say that I was in my second and last marriage or something like that, and Diane didn't like the locution, so I turned it into, I'm now in my ultimate marriage. But she was a single mom for a long time. We were both divorced for about a dozen years each, and it was real tough. I understand how tough it is, but we got to do better. I look at my wrist and there's no watch there. Let me do this. If it starts running too long, I'll cut it off as I did with the other thing. But when I wrote the book that came out in 2011, From Family Collapse to America's Decline, colon, every book has to have a colon. The educational, economic, and social costs of family fragmentation. And for one of the two education chapters, I talked about all the things we've attempted to do since war and poverty began in 1965, tried to do to improve schools. Some of these are very good ideas, but taken as a whole, have they really changed much? I would say no. Which is indicative of how tough this is, and how I'll come back to how it's a matter of these cultural questions. What do we do when no one is looking? How hard do we work? How serious do we take our academic work? Talking about families again. Those are the things I would argue are at least as important as the policy questions, though it's easier for most people to focus on policy questions. So this is the list I put together, and I won't even give you the narrative. I'll just read you the boldface, the title. Starting off, the three-legged stool of standards, assessments, and accountability. And you could have a separate chapter for each one. We tried increased spending. We tried smaller classes. We've tried smaller schools. We've tried teacher-run schools. We've tried privately managed public schools and districts. We have tried public school choice, and you can break that one down to tax credits for educational expenses. You can talk about thanks to Rudy Perpich and others, being able to go across what were known as the Berlin walls of school districts. Kids now can go to another district, and there's post-secondary enrollment options, and there are charter schools. And we can do a chapter for each of those. Private school choice, tax credits, vouchers, vouchers that are paid by the government, vouchers that are paid by generous individuals or philanthropies. Extra courses. If you go back to the Nation at Risk report, big report in 1983, said if foreign government had been doing to us educationally what we're doing to ourselves, we'd consider it an act of war. Their main recommendation is, well, we need more courses, heavy-duty academic courses. And so we did that. One of the unfortunate aspects of that, vocationally oriented classes to a significant degree went away, and for many kids, that's what they needed. They did better in those kinds of courses. We tried extra, and still are, extra intensive new schools, KIPP academies, if you're familiar with those. We tried to focus more on early childhood education. This might be very important. Everybody says it is. It has the momentum. No one is going to vote against these programs now. They may try to slice them back a bit, but everyone says we have to have early childhood education, particularly for poor kids. What's generally ignored, however, is that there has been an enormous increase in the number of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds over the last couple of decades taking one kind of preschool program or another. And if you ask me, has that improved academic performance across the board? The answer is no. Compensatory education, special education, multicultural education, bilingual education, different ways of teaching reading, different ways of teaching math, different ways of teaching teachers, different ways of compensating teachers, different ways of hiring teachers, alternative certification and all. Desegregation, meaning busing, either voluntary or not voluntary, into magnet schools and the like, or neighborhood schools, when people said, well, all this busing is not working real well. And many of the people saying, no, we shouldn't do this anymore, have been people of color, and wonderfully brave. Sharon Sales Belton, when she was mayor of Minneapolis, did exactly that. Sharon's a good friend. High tech. You can make an argument, and I've read some of the material coming out of this fine institution, that you can have too much high tech, and I would agree, but we can certainly take smarter advantage of it in teaching kids than we often do. Improve ties between schools and parents. We have tried that. There's a whole subfield about that. Improve ties between schools and businesses. Often when we talk about the ties between the two, it has meant a business shelling out some money to buy football uniforms or a computer or 4 or 5. You get the idea. More importantly, what businesses have done, I would argue, is to say, hey, we got to do better. We can do better. And they have urged various blue ribbon commissions, and they've participated in them, and some of them have helped. If you go back to the mid-1980s, early 1980s in Minnesota, it was the Minnesota Business Partnership that led the way, along with some other think tanks, one in particular, the Citizens League, in pushing for open enrollment, which has been a great success. Minnesota, I should jump in here, so I'll get to it at the end. I may repeat it at the end. When it comes to school choice, Minnesota used to be the locomotive, I should say. Locomotive, that's a song. Okay. That we were the locomotive. We were the first state allowing kids to go from one district to another. We were the first state with post-secondary enrollment options, allowing high school juniors and seniors to take courses in college. We were the first state with charter schools. We were the first state with tax credits for at least certain education expenses. but we stopped. It's not as if we haven't tried. And we can talk about the politics, and Senator Chamberlain may want to talk about the politics of it all. But we were the locomotive, and now we're closer to the caboose, as many, many other states have done much more important things than we have when it comes to expanding educational freedom and opportunity. Well, we talked about and pursued decentralization and centralization and more. This was, as I say, put together about, well, my goodness, 7 years ago now, and any number of things we could have added in more recent years. And again, I'm not suggesting that these haven't been good ideas. Many of them have. So why haven't they worked as well as we have hope? Some of the suggested answers, as you know, would be, well, not enough money, and maybe sometimes. Too many political fights, without question. Poverty, yes, no question. Racism, yes, but racism and its effects are, I would argue, generally overstated and exaggerated, and we can talk about that if you would like. There's an element of truth in just about all of this. But I would add, there are real problems, for example, in bringing great programs to scale. Think of a really good school. I mean, they are just beating the odds. The teachers are magnificent, the leadership is terrific, the kids are doing well, doing better than people might imagine. And you try to replicate that across the country, and it doesn't necessarily work. Why? Well, if it's a really special place, it was probably created and is being led now by really special people. And when they leave, it's not that the next round of folks aren't talented, but they're not the same people. And when they try to expand in other locations, they're not going to find the really exceptional leaders and teachers. So bringing things to scale, and not just in education, it is really difficult. Then there's the matter of consistently holding kids to high standards, which can be very, very difficult. I first realized this, or I saw it up close and personal, with KIPP schools, Knowledge is Power program, where these teachers are absolutely demanding of the kids every moment of the day, as is the case here from what I can tell. I spent a couple of hours here one day. Most educators can't do that. It seems to me it's exhausting. It is demanding. Most kids perhaps don't want to put up with it. They'd rather be someplace else. Colleges of education are not in that spirit. They're much more progressive than that. I say this with affection, a lot more loosier-goosier than what you might find in a place, an excellent place like this. And then, of course, I would say there's not enough competition. And we don't rely nearly enough on private and religious schools. We need more of them. Those are some of the policy areas. How am I doing with time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, all right. Cultural reasons, social reasons. And again, I'm able to talk about these kinds of things because I was a dreadful student in junior high school and in high school. People don't realize that. I was. Why? Well, my best answer, which no one believes, is that I worked so hard in 6th grade I burned out. And I'm gathering you're not believing it either. I was troubled, all right? Or more precisely, I was lazy and I didn't do my work, but I was troubled. And I mentioned Al Quie, and Rebecca mentioned Al Quie, the former governor, congressman. I was his speechwriter, among other things. I'm his biographer. And my wife and I were having dinner with him and his late wife, Gretchen, about 20 years ago, maybe more. And I said, and I'm now 70, and I said, and I did grow up in an interesting situation, and let it go at that. And I said, once I reached 40, I decided that any shortcomings in me were my responsibility. I wasn't going to blame anybody else. And Gretchen looked at me in the great Norwegian Midwestern way, and she said, "It took until you were 40?" And I felt like a bit of an idiot. I simply didn't do my homework. And as a general rule, we don't demand enough of students. Variation on the theme. The Gophers did great this past Saturday, beat the heck out of Purdue, but the previous week they got killed by Illinois. And P.J. Fleck, the coach, said after the game, he was quoted in one of the stories, that the problem was 100% his fault. No, it wasn't. The players had something to do with it. And we do not, point being, we don't lay enough responsibility on young people to work hard and get it done. Perfect example of how culture changes and how this affects education. I went to Far Rockaway High School in New York, Queens, almost right on the beach. Great school, public school, not a specialized school, not like Stuyvesant where you had to take a test to get in, all comers. And between 1965 and 1976, 3 Far Rockaway alumni won Nobel Prizes, and another one won a Pulitzer. You may know the name Richard Feynman, the physicist. He won in 1965. In 1976, this was some year, Baruch Samuel Blumberg won in medicine, Burton Richter won in physics, and Alan Kriegsman won a Pulitzer Prize for dance criticism. In 1 year, our alumni won 2 Nobel Prizes and a Pulitzer. A few years later, Far Rockaway High School didn't exist anymore. They had to close it down. Lousy academic performance and other problems. This is where it gets really dicey. The names I mentioned, those are good Jewish boys. We worked hard. I didn't, but most of my folks did. And when the school eventually closed down, I think within the last 8-10 years, the school wasn't disproportionately Jewish anymore. It was minority. And the kids were doing terribly. And there were fights. And the city closed down the school. So I've written about this, and I didn't say anything about ethnicity at all. But as you might expect, someone accused me of trying to suggest that kids of color aren't smart. This is the risk when one talks about culture, and I would argue in these kinds of instances, culture is the most important thing. What we do when no one's looking. By the way, I held the flag at the assembly for Richard Feynman. For some reason, I was selected. And among our other alumni, Dr. Joyce Brothers, if you remember her, Nancy Lieberman, the great basketball player with whom I had a date once. And I'm not proud to say Bernie Madoff. He was an alumnus. Happily, I never met him. I wasn't rich enough to be on his view. In 1983, when I was at the Pioneer Press, I was an editorial writer there. I read a story in the New York Times that said to me, until and unless this changes, the United States won't catch up with the rest of the world, and we will not do well when it comes to trying to improve our schools' education reforms. What did I read? It was a study led by a professor of psychology at Michigan who had done his doctorate in Minnesota, Harold Stevenson, the late Harold Stevenson. And he was a great expert in comparative international education. And his team did a study where they talked to mothers in China, Taiwan, and in the United States. And I think the American mothers could have been in Ridgefield. Minnesota. And one of the things they found, to me, powerfully indicative and important, that if a kid in Taiwan or in China was not doing well in math, his or her mother would say, well, it's because they're not working hard enough. In the United States, if a kid was not doing well in math or whatever the subject might have been, the mother was more likely to say, well, she's just not very good in math. He's just not very good in math. Think of the implications of trying to get better. In the first instance, you better get better. Second instance, you let it fly by. Powerful. There's a book from 1996. I sound like I went to graduate school, don't I? Called Beyond the Classroom by Lawrence Steinberg. He interviewed, and his team, 20,000, or at least had surveys, 20,000 students and parents from 9 diverse high schools in Wisconsin and California. And this is what they found, that peer pressures were powerful, and the cliques, the groups that kids hung out with, were very important, suggesting you take education seriously, you're engaged academically, or less so. Well, consistently, Asian kids did best, white kids next, Hispanic kids next, African American kids last, I'm afraid. And it had everything to do with peer pressures. I suspect you have heard the term acting white. If you watch the interview on 2020 with the First Lady the other night, she said when growing up she was accused of sounding white. And she had this line about if you sounded white or if you came across that way in her old neighborhood, you could get beaten up. The slur that a kid is acting white, it's more than a slur, it's a threat. It's more powerful in keeping black kids down, and not just black kids, than any policy we have. There is, from another angle, no policy we can adopt. Nothing a politician can do that can overcome that intimidation. So many kids will not work hard because they don't want to come across as acting white. My wife, the Reverend McGowan, was a deacon at an all-black church, mostly black church, for about 10 years, and I was there all the time. And a remarkable bunch of folks, generally older. And I asked one of them once, John at the time was probably in his 70s, and he grew up in the South, as many of these people did. I said, have you ever heard the term acting white? He had no idea what I was talking about. It's something of recent decades, and it's very damaging. Let me jump ahead to the end here. What to do? This is the shortest part of the presentation. Many things you can do. Many of the things I read before would be helpful if pursued correctly. Some might not, some would not. Again, we need to do a better job with digital education. No question about that. But also no question, we need to do a better job when it comes to real-life educational freedom, real-life choice, real-life competition, helping parents make the best possible decision for their kids, irrespective of how rich they might or might not be. What animates me about real-life school choice? And when I say real-life, that means it includes private schools and includes religious schools. Well, any number of people on the right, and I'm one of those people on the right, will cite a famous book by a famous economist, Milton Friedman, great libertarian, conservative, free market economist who died a number of years ago, who wrote a book in 1955 when he talked about, we would do better in this country instead of having these big bureaucracies. You give parents the equivalent of what it would cost to educate the kid, and they would then decide where the kid should go to school. Simple idea. We do it with supermarkets, we do it with everything. So people assume that it's my devotion to free market economics that lead me to my devotion to choice. And the answer is, well, it helps, certainly. But what really moves me is that there are whole generations of kids growing up with holes in their hearts where their daddy should be, or sometimes where their mommy should be, or sometimes where both should be. And I ask myself, well, what kind of school might work best for kids in those circumstances? For many, public schools are just great. And 90% of American kids go to public schools, only 10% in private school. But if I ask myself, what kind of school might be the most nurturing? The kind of school where a teacher can say, we got to do better. God wants you to do better. It's not going to move all kids. It'll help some. And those are the kids I'm thinking about most of all. And we have to find ways to better help those kids. Final little story. Back when I was an editorial writer at the Pioneer Press, this would have been in 1986, a very good friend of mine, a great education scholar by the name of Chester E. Finn Jr., Checker Finn, was in the Department of Education. He was Bill Bennett's number one person. And Bennett was the Secretary of Education. He was terrific, and some of you may know him now. He's on the radio and he's on television. He does any number of important things. A well-educated fellow, PhD in philosophy, from the University of Texas and a law degree from Harvard. And most importantly, a fine, tough football player. So I wound up playing touch football with him a year after this, and it was fine male bonding. But in 1986, and I went to work in Washington in 87, I asked my friend Checker, I said, well, if you're all that important, you can get me an interview with the secretary. And he did. And went in to see him. And we were having a fine chat, talking about many of the things I'm talking about now. And I saw his assistant, a guy who has become a very good friend, the writer Pete Wehner. I saw him look at his watch, and I said, well, to myself, I have one question left. And I said, Mr. Secretary, it seems to me we haven't been talking about programs and budgets and rules and regs because I was an editorial writer. I could ask the big questions. We've been talking about the culture. How do you change the very culture? And by the way, I've ended any number of pieces and books with the same line, so if you've heard it before several times, my apologies. How do you change the culture? And the Secretary of Education said, that's a real good question. He had been thinking about it a lot, and the best answer he had was that you say what you believe in your heart to be true, and you say it over and over and over again. And without trivializing my career, in many ways, that's what I have done. In some ways, not anything more sophisticated than that. You have to find ways to say what you really believe if it's a really tough subject, always doing so with as much courage as you can, but also as much grace as you can. And with that, I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, I lost my glass.
Your what?
My other glass.
On the stage.
Oh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitch Pearlstein. We are very grateful to have you here tonight. And that last comment that you made, you didn't realize it, but you actually touched on some of our body of values. And one of our values here is courageous leadership and loving relationships, biblical principles. So speaking the truth in love is something that we do emphasize here. And changing the culture is something that we hope that our students will do when they go out. So thank you for touching on all of that. We are going to open up the opportunity for questions here. We have Mr. Martinez over on that side taking questions, and I will take some over here. I might have to go over there since there's more people, so we'll see. Who would like to start? Anybody have a question?
We have Vitaly Brown, a senior at Liberty Classical Academy. Not with this one.
Well, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out here tonight and talking about education and society. And the question I had was, if the United States of America isn't the smartest guy on the block compared to the other countries, how is it that we continually have one of the best and most successful economies in the world? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there should be a correlation between intelligence in a country and economic success. I mean, at the end of the day, does it come down to sheer hard work, or, I don't know, can you inform us more, though, on that?
Yeah, great question. And as I said, you can find anything that you want in a country as big as ours and a world as big as ours. I would say this. We came out of World War II in a great situation compared to the rest of the world. And since that time, the rest of the world has been catching up. And there is Britanishuk's work showing that for a country where the people are not as equipped, let's say mathematically, scientifically, our businesses are in a less favored situation in terms of adopting innovations, for example. And if we don't have enough people who are trained in STEM subjects, and not just being specialists in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. See, I'm really good at this stuff. At least have some literacy in it, fluency in it. And the rest of the world is, in fact, catching up. We're not without our strengths, obviously, thankfully. We are one of the biggest countries in the world. We forget that sometimes. But it's tough to have so many people not fully engaged because of whatever problems, educational or otherwise, that they might have. And China's real big, and India is real big. And there are indeed some people who think we will be surpassed by them. When I was doing Broken Bonds, what Family Collapse means for America's future. That came out 4 years ago. One of the people I interviewed was a political scientist at the Kennedy School, Paul Peterson, who's originally from Montevideo, Minnesota. And he was really quite direct. It's perhaps only a matter of time before the Chinese overtake us in some categories and others perhaps as well. We've got to do better. And frankly, sometimes I don't think we have it in us. That's a happy thought.
All right. Good answer, though. It's good to have that perspective because especially as young people, they don't always have that perspective, and I think even we as adults forget that perspective. All right, other questions? Wow, we have okay.
Sure. Hi, Mitch. I've seen you over the years at various American Experiment events. And I was wondering how much this correlates, I probably know the answer, but to removal of God in society and our cultural change away from that and going towards multiculturalism, diversity, et cetera, back from the 3 R's, God and culture, and other, sadly to mention, deviant practices that our schools tend to practice, probably not here, and I praise this school for at least having a decent one around here, which we need more of. But how much of this really corresponds to that if you were to graph it, or from your experience, have you seen it change since you graduated to now?
I wouldn't even begin to graph it. I wouldn't talk in mathematical or scientific terms about correlation. I would hit it in some other ways. Here's a way, though it may sound as if I'm dancing around. I went to, as I say, public schools all throughout. The only time I ever spent in a private school was driver's ed. Elementary, junior high, high school, undergraduate, graduate school, all public. And my elementary school, PS 215, the Lucretia Mott School in Far Rockaway, had to be, this is no overstatement, 90% Jewish. What did we do at Easter one year when I think I was in the 4th grade? We had an Easter program. It wasn't a highly religious Easter assembly program. You had a bunch of kids walking on stage, Easter parade and all, but we acknowledged Easter. Try to imagine a public school doing that now and the ACLU being quiet. It's not going to happen. A couple years later, when I was a sophomore in high school at Far Rockaway High School, in a music class, we sang Handel's Messiah. I mean, some of the good stuff, too. That wouldn't happen now. I can only say that for my family, a religiously animated school has worked best. When I said my wife had been divorced, my stepsons, now my stepsons, at the time were young. And they weren't doing well in school. Family had some money, then they didn't have any money in Edina. And my wife, at the time, before I showed up, decided that the kids needed to go, and this was after a couple of years, to Holy Angels in Benil. And we had a member of the family, my wife's Aunt Jane, the great matriarch of the family, who was wonderful and supportive. And she wrote some checks, and the kids went to, 2 of them went to Holy Angels and 1 to Benil. And I'm not necessarily going to draw a straight line from that to the fact that they're all successful and happily married, and each one can buy me out 14 times. But at that stage in their lives, it worked. So let me do it this way. I would be much happier if we had more opportunities in this society to take advantage of our religious institutions and strengths. When I first wrote the prospectus for American Experiment 30 years ago, and stop me anytime I keep on coming up with these numbers, I'm just amazed. I wrote a line about how we needed to take greater advantage of our religious institutions and traditions while fully respecting the First Amendment of American variety, American diversity, because not doing so is like trying to help people in need with a powerful arm tied behind our back. And still believe it. The wall separating church and state, as I believed at the time, as I still believe, yes, there is a wall, should be a wall, but the wall is not as tall and is not as thick as some people make it out to be. It's a metaphor. So, how about that? Okay.
Mr. John Hand, faculty at Liberty Classical Academy.
Thank you very much for your talk here. It's very interesting and obviously very important to all of us. If I've understood you correctly, the problem of education right now is primarily a cultural issue or tied to cultural problems, but we have a hard time talking about cultural problems because of political correctness. What do we do about political correctness, both from as a parent, as a student, as teachers? What's the best way that we can change that and overcome that? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great question. Well, the first thing I would say is that opposing PC doesn't mean being rude and crude. You can interpret that as you'd like. And you really do have to do it with feeling, with courage and grace. And even then, we're not winning. How did it go? A day or two ago, I got an email from a faculty friend at the university I've done a lot of work with when it comes to families. A person of the moderate left, but when it comes to these kinds of issues, he's much more comfortable with conservatives than he is with people on his side of the aisle. And he wanted to know if there was any political leader, I was talking to Senator Chamberlain about this at the start, is there any political leader out there who is really willing to challenge not just the PC, but the whole question, deal with the whole question of family breakdown, family fragmentation? And I am hard-pressed to come up with anybody. The closest I get to is Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who probably won't be listened to by any number of people because he's a conservative Republican. This is real tough. We did a symposium. When I say a symposium, not a face-to-face one, but I would invite people to write short essays and we would collect them. And it was fascinating. I've done that on various topics over the years, and I would invite via email my 1,000 closest friends to write, and I would always they would come back with about 25 to 35 pieces. And the name of, there were two in a row that were akin, but this was right after the presidential election, during which neither Trump nor Clinton said word one about any of this. And I asked the question, was their silence golden on this issue? And whatever the answer was, the fact of the matter is they didn't say anything about it, and no great expectation that people in leadership positions will, because they can get beaten up terribly. You know. Hope that answers sort of the question. I lost you. Where are you? Okay. Thank you.
We have a question right here, too.
Okay.
Last Christmas, we were in Arkansas, in a high school, outside the high school. On their 40-foot banner was Merry Christmas. I returned to a Bible study here in White Bear Lake and said, why don't we have Merry Christmas on the high schools here? And they said, but Joe, that's the Bible Belt. And then I asked, why isn't Minnesota the Bible Belt?
Well, I thought you were going in a different direction. Why aren't we as comfortable with wishing people Merry Christmas? I'm in a better position than most because I'm Jewish, number one. Number two, I'm married to Episcopal clergy. And we had an event, our annual holiday party for young folks, meaning up to 40 or so, I guess. And one of the directors was holding the mic, and he was talking, and he was getting ready to wish everybody a fine holiday season, and he said he couldn't, and he's a lawyer, by the way, he couldn't wish them Merry Christmas. And I shot up my hand, I said, I can, and I said, Merry Christmas. Some of it is just so silly. I understand the sensitivities. I grew up with particularly my maternal grandparents and that whole generation, thinking everybody was out to get them, and often that was the case. I have more confidence in this country than many people do, most people perhaps. For example, when Joe Lieberman was named Al Gore's running mate in 2000, I really don't think that Gore lost the presidency because he had a Jewish running mate. Probably helped him in Florida. In this state, for any number of years, we had the Boschwitz chair in the Senate. Rudy Boschwitz to Paul Wellstone to Norm Coleman to Al Franken, all Jewish. Franken is reported to have said once that Minnesota is simply not ready for a Gentile senator. But we had all these folks. 2% of the population in this state is Jewish. Wisconsin, for a while had two at the same time. Their population, Jewish population, is even smaller. So I have great confidence that people here do the right thing. But in terms of being extra careful about wishing people Merry Christmas, I don't like it.
We have Dr. Sheard, Science Department at Liberty Classical Academy.
Hi, thank you for coming. So to me, it sounds a little discouraging. I'm kind of reminded of a couple of decades ago reading Bork's book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah. But aren't you just a little optimistic with the way things have turned out with its administration, with the Supreme Court, that there could be cultural changes, that we're not just on a ramp down? I just am a little optimistic. Growing up in the 80s, I never ever thought I would see the day where there'd be a conservative majority on the court. I would never, millennials, a more originalist justices on the court. And so can you comment on that, on if that changes your view at all, or if you have any thoughts?
Are there any reporters in the room? I am very pleased with the President's Supreme Court appointees. Another sign, by the way, of how this is a good place, a fundamentally decent society. Until Neil Gorsuch was named, appointed, there weren't any Protestants on the Supreme Court. Do you know that? 5 Catholics, 4 Jews. And the fact that hardly anyone knew about this or talked about it, this was a sign of maturity. I think someone should have said, if the country has a plurality of Protestants, it'd be nice to have 1 or 2 on the court. And I wrote that, by the way, I wrote that. But the point I made before about the opposite of political correctness is not being rude. And to be real direct, I don't go around talking about politics in any electoral way, or the president. Number one, American Experiment is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're forbidden when it comes to getting involved in partisan activities. Plus, I'm not the president anymore, so it's not my role to talk about some of these things. But at the very same time that we have the good Supreme Court appointments, and we are, in a fashion, challenging some of the excesses, I'm afraid too frequently it's done in a way, and it's not just the president, done in a way that suggests to lots of people that people on the right are not the nicest, kindest people. And this is a problem. And I'm not talking about Charlottesville and people being killed. It's in part that when George H. What was the line George H.W. Bush used when he became president? As he was, something about sweeter. What was the term? And people criticized him, thinking it was a criticism of Reagan. Kinder, gentler. That was the term. He used kinder, gentler. And they're words. And then W talked about compassionate conservatism, which got beaten up by everybody left and right, when in fact, if you look closely, it was a very demanding way of looking at the world. Compassion as in suffering with, not just passing the buck. I miss those kinds of impulses. Things are a little too crude going on in the country right now, and I don't equate being crude with challenging political correctness and doing some real heavy lifting when it comes to fixing problems and being respectful of people. Hope that answers the question. Poorly or not? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. as a parent who has a very young daughter who's just embarking on her academic career, I'm asking this question from that perspective. We already emphasize faith in our home. We already want to certainly, portray the value of academics in our home. But what types of things should we be looking for in a school, or maybe even specific educational methods we should be seeking, as we, decide where to, send our daughter for her academic career?
Is she here in this school?
No, just very young.
Okay.
Preschool at this moment.
Do you have a preschool?
We do.
Okay.
It's called Liberty Classical Academy. That's what you need to do.
What feels right? That's not meant to be evasive. You got to do your research and find out what's going on in various schools, talk to people. But I believe that if it feels right, that's where you send your kid. And if it doesn't work, you can move your child. When we adopted a little 5-year-old a long time ago now, and after the boys had done well in Catholic schools, and so the youngest was of the boys was 19, and now we're adopting a 5-year-old special needs little girl. We had success with Catholic schools. We said, let's send her to a Catholic school. And we looked around and we decided to do Risen Christ in Minneapolis. We were living in Minneapolis at the time. And loved the school, but the daycare program afterwards, my wife didn't like because the kids were roughhousing too much. And we were both working, so we needed the daycare or the after school. So we went looking for another one and decided to go to Annunciation in South Minneapolis, and we were real happy about that. My daughter wasn't necessarily, but we were. So I would do research, I'd do a lot of visiting, and just I ask, it's an extension, when someone is trying to figure out what they want to do professionally with their lives or some question like that, I'll ask, what feels right as you're falling off to sleep at night? And so what school would fit well? And if it works, wonderful, and if it doesn't, find another one. You're going to have to find another one at some point anyway because of middle school, high school, and all of that. Good luck.
All right. We're going to do one more question. Oh, you have one too? All right. Okay. We actually said we would end at 8:30, but I'd like to be able to give a few more questions.
Oh, by all means. Okay. You need to know I'm a kosher ham. I love this stuff. All right.
Hi, I'm a public school teacher, and you mentioned culture, and I go to in-service training, and sometimes I think it's more cult than culture, and we talk about there's classes in social justice, and there's even a social justice math class at one of the schools, not at the public school, and the word equity comes up a lot. Every time I see equity and social justice, I know I'm in trouble. We had a thing that talked about collectivism as a really positive thing because we're talking about teamwork and working together, but kind of missing some of the downsides of collectivism. Those are very common, well espoused, and I think kids really buy into it. I don't have a comment, but I want to know, what do you think of when you hear those things at the U or wherever you hear, and how can we, as more on the objective side of things, talk about those things? Not necessarily fight it out, but just say objectively, what is it we're trying to get done here, and then can we try some different things besides those?
My response is exactly yours. I know what is meant, I know what is not meant. And I'm all for equity, and I'm all for social justice, but I'm also for freedom and liberty and strength and so forth. I sit on the Dean's Council of the Humphrey School. And why do I sit on that body as I get appointed to some other things like the United Way Board? They know they're not going to get a lot of money out of me because I don't have, but to their credit, they want an alternative voice here and there. So right now I'm one of about 2 alternative voices on the Humphrey. People know Peter Bell, my colleague from American Experiment. We're the 2 alternative voices at the Humphrey School. And there was a time, maybe about a year ago, I said, I've been sitting here, and it was many years now I've been on it, and I hear about equity and equality and all those good things and justice all the time. Great. I've never heard the word freedom, not once, not once. And people are scratching their head. There's a program, give you another dotted line example, I suspect, and I say this with affection for the Humphrey School. They do some really nice things there, though it sort of tilts. They have had in the past a program on women doing better, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the faculty member who led that got a far better job at, I think it was at Tulane, paid her a whole bunch more money, so she went. And every time we would have a meeting of the council, which we do about 3 times a year, some of the women on the council would ask, well, where do we stand with the women's program? And the dean would explain what was going on. We're moving in the direction, but we don't have anybody right now, and so on and so forth. And my hand would go up. I think I did it twice. I said, you know, it's really good that we have a program for women. But if you take a look at what's going on in the United States educationally and other ways, girls are doing a whole bunch better than boys. I think we should, and I meant it seriously, not that I expected anything to change. We should have a program also about boys and men. Nothing came out of that, but I played my role. Yes, it would be nice if everything didn't suggest something on the left, without question. Yeah.
Sir, in 7 months, our seniors will be graduating. I think very highly of our seniors. They are a collective group of intelligent young men and women. If you could look them in the eye and give them a piece of advice as they are pursuing their dreams, as they are heading out into the colleges and universities in the United States of America, what would that be?
You would think I would be better on this question. One thing might be, particularly if you're at a decent place, decent college or university, and most of them are, or if they're not wonderful, you can make them so by working hard. Start from the premise that anything you do not learn that you're supposed to is your responsibility and your fault. Okay? That's how I view my undergraduate work at a terrific place, what's now known as Binghamton University. That place offered me a bunch. Sometimes I took advantage of it, sometimes I didn't. In a less lofty way, when thinking about what you want to major in, what kind of career that you want, ask yourself what kind of people you want to hang out with every day. I aspire to hang out with university types. I got very lucky. I wound up working at Binghamton University shortly after I graduated with a guy by the name of C. Peter McGraw, who wound up being the president out here 2 years later, and he brought me out. I got very lucky. I wanted to live in that world, hence I picked a doctorate in educational policy. And the point I made before, but what really feels good as you're falling off to sleep, that's a great test for me. And maybe to pull it all together, recognize how lucky we are in this country for all the things I might have suggested that aren't working all that well and that make me mad. We are one lucky people, not just across the world, but across history. I often think about that when someone is complaining about something, I try not to be rude, and I'll say, yeah, look how lucky we are. Look how lucky you are. Start with I think I may have read this in some of your material, and Michael Medved talks about it. Gratitude. You start with gratitude. And I try to do that, and I would recommend it. So good luck, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are very much
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.